At 10:35 hours on April 9th, 1942, 85 Aichi D-3A Valdive bombers screamed down on two ships steaming southwest from Trincomalee. HMS Vampire maneuvered desperately, her 4-inch guns firing, her 2-pounder pom-poms hammering. Every automatic weapon aboard tracking targets that came from all directions at once. The destroyer turned hard to starboard, then hard to port, chasing salvos, throwing up spray that marked near misses. The aircraft carrier HMS Hermes, 3 miles ahead, was already burning from multiple hits. At 10:37 hours, 3 bombs struck Vampire in quick succession. 1 hit forward of the bridge, 1 hit amidships near the engine room, 1 hit aft. The explosions tore through the unarmored hull of a ship built in 1917 to fight submarines and German destroyers in the North Sea. She broke in half. The forward section rolled to port and sank immediately. The aft section floated briefly. Stern up, propellers still turning, then slipped beneath the surface. 9 minutes from first hit to final sinking. 9 of her crew killed, 183 men in the water 3 miles off the coast of Ceylon. This was the end of HMAS Vampire, originally HMS Wallace, built at Cowes for World War I service, transferred to Australia in 1933. Part of the scrap iron flotilla that defended the Mediterranean against Italy and Germany for 2 years, survivor of hundreds of convoy escorts, dozens of bombardments, evacuations from Greece and Crete, the hunt for Italian submarines, the supply runs to besiege Tobruk. She had fought through it all. She died covering the withdrawal of an aircraft carrier from a base that could no longer be defended. The story begins not with the ship, but with the transfer. In 1933, the Royal Australian Navy needed to replace its aging S-class destroyers. 5 ships had been on loan from the Royal Navy since 1919. HMAS Stalwart, Success, Swordsman, Tasmania, and Tattoo, plus the flotilla leader HMAS Anzac, all were worn out. All needed replacement. The Australian government requested newer vessels. The Admiralty selected 5 V&W class destroyers from reserve. HMS Stuart, the Scott-class flotilla leader, HMS Vampire and HMS Vendetta, both V-class, HMS Voyager and HMS Waterhen, both W-class. These ships were hardly new. Stuart had been completed in December 1918. The others were commissioned in 1917. They had served through World War I. They had spent the 1920s in the Mediterranean or Atlantic fleets. By 1933, they were 15 years old. But they were available, and they were better than what Australia had. On October 11, 1933, all 5 ships were paid off from Royal Navy service at Portsmouth and commissioned into the Royal Australian Navy. Commander Harry Howden took command of Vampire. Captain Austin Lilly commanded the flotilla from Stuart. On October 17th, the flotilla departed Chatham. They sailed via Suez, Singapore, and Darwin, reaching Sydney on December 21st, 1933. Vampire was HMS Wallace when built, laid down October 10th, 1916 at J. Samuel White and Company in Cowes on the Isle of Wight. Launched May 21st, 1917. Completed and commissioned September 22nd, 1917. The ship was one of 5 Admiralty V-class flotilla leaders ordered under the 1916-17 construction program. Originally, she was to be different from standard V-class destroyers, with enhanced accommodations for flotilla command staff. To save time, the differences were minimized. She became a standard V-class with slightly modified internal arrangements. The specifications reflected World War I destroyer practice. Length 95.1 meters overall, beam 9.1 meters, draft 3.4 meters, standard displacement 1,090 tons, full load displacement 1,490 tons. This was small, even by 1917 standards, smaller than American flush deckers, smaller than Japanese destroyers of the same era. But she was fast. 2 sets of Brown Curtis-geared steam turbines drove 2 shafts. 4 Yarrow water tube boilers generated 27,000 shaft horsepower. Maximum speed 34 knots. Range was limited. 2,500 nautical miles at 15 knots. 1,000 nautical miles at full speed. For North Sea operations in 1917, this was adequate. For Mediterranean service in 1940, it was marginal. Armament consisted of 4 QF 4-inch Mark V guns. 2 forward, 2 aft. No superfiring mounts. Each gun was in an open shield mounting. 1 QF, 2-pounder gun for anti-aircraft defense. 2 triple 21-inch torpedo tubes, 1 on each beam. 4 depth charge chutes aft, plus 2 depth charge throwers, added later. Total depth charge capacity, 50 charges. This was adequate for anti-submarine work, but limited for surface combat. The 4-inch gun was a World War I weapon firing a 31-pound shell to 10,400 yards. Effective against destroyers and submarines. Inadequate against modern cruisers or properly armored warships. After commissioning into the Royal Navy in September 1917, Vampire joined the 4th Destroyer Flotilla. She served through the final months of World War I, conducting convoy escorts and anti-submarine patrols. The High Seas Fleet sortied once more in April 1918, and Vampire was part of the screen that went to intercept. The German fleet turned back before contact. That was the closest she came to surface action during the war. After the armistice, Vampire served in home waters and the Mediterranean. She was placed in reserve in 1921. Recommissioned in June 1924 for service with the 5th Destroyer Flotilla in the Mediterranean. Served until 1925. Then, transferred to the Atlantic Fleet until 1931. Back to the Mediterranean in 1927 with the 1st Destroyer Flotilla. By 1931, she was back in reserve. In July 1917, before commissioning, the Admiralty changed her name from Wallace to Vampire. The reason is unclear. Perhaps Wallace was needed for another vessel. Perhaps the Admiralty decided 5 V-class ships should all have V names. When Australia received her in October 1933, Vampire still carried her World War I configuration. The next 5 years she spent mostly in reserve at Flinders Naval Depot, functioning as a tender ship for training. In May 1938, with war approaching, she was recommissioned for full service. Commander Howden remained in command. The ship resumed training duties and exercises in Australian waters. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. On September 3, Britain declared war. Australia followed 6 hours later. The Royal Australian Navy mobilized. On October 14, 1939, HMS Stuart, Vampire, Vendetta, Voyager, and Waterhen departed Australia for Singapore. Commander Hector Waller commanded the flotilla from Stuart. The plan was to base them at Singapore for training, then deploy them for convoy defense. While the flotilla was at sea, the orders changed. Mediterranean, not Singapore. The British Mediterranean fleet needed destroyers. Italy was neutral but threatening. France was mobilized but inactive. The phony war on land meant maximum effort at sea. Every available destroyer was needed for convoy escort and patrol. The scrap iron flotilla would go to the Mediterranean. They didn't know that name yet. That would come later. The flotilla split up for the passage from Singapore. The ships arrived at Malta between December 11th and December 14th, 1939. Vampire arrived December 12th. They joined the British Mediterranean Fleet as the 10th Destroyer Flotilla. Their commanding officer was Admiral Andrew Brown Cunningham, Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean. Cunningham believed in aggressive action. He would use every ship he had to maximum effect. The scrap iron flotilla would be no exception. The nickname came from Joseph Goebbels in early 1940. The Nazi propaganda minister learned that 5 obsolete Australian destroyers had been sent to the Mediterranean. He derided them in a broadcast as scrap iron. The description was accurate enough. The ships were 22 years old. Their engines were worn. Their weapons were obsolete. Their armor was non-existent. By 1940 standards, they were relics. The crews adopted the name with pride. Scrap iron they might be, but they would fight. And they did from January 2nd, 1940. The scrap iron flotilla operated almost continuously. Convoy escorts between Malta and Alexandria. Patrols off North Africa. Anti-submarine sweeps in the Aegean. Night bombardment of Italian positions. Supply runs to isolated garrisons. The missions were endless. The ships were always at sea. On June 10th, 1940, Italy declared war on Britain and France. The Mediterranean became a combat zone. The Italian fleet included 5 battleships, 25 cruisers, 90 destroyers, 100 submarines. The Royal Navy Mediterranean Fleet counted 3 battleships, 1 aircraft carrier, 9 cruisers, 30 destroyers. The scrap iron flotilla formed 1/6 of the destroyer strength. Their contribution would be essential. On July 9, 1940, Vampire escorted the aircraft carrier HMS Eagle during the Battle of Calabria. Italian bombers attacked Eagle repeatedly. Near misses showered Vampire's deck with splinters. A Royal Navy torpedo gunner serving aboard Vampire died from wounds 3 days later. He was the first fatality aboard a Royal Australian Navy ship in World War II. The battle was inconclusive, but demonstrated that Italian air power posed serious threats. Through July and August 1940, Vampire conducted convoy escorts. Malta to Alexandria, Alexandria to Malta. The convoys ran continuously, moving supplies, reinforcements, equipment. German and Italian aircraft attacked regularly. Submarines stalked the routes. The destroyers were always at action stations. Sleep came in snatches. Meals were eaten standing up. Engineering crews nursed engines that vibrated excessively at speeds above 20 knots. The ships needed overhauls they couldn't receive because they were needed at sea. In September 1940, the Italian 10th Army invaded Egypt from Libya. The Western Desert Campaign began. The Royal Navy supported the British Army with shore bombardments and supply runs. The Scrap Iron Flotilla bombarded Italian positions along the coast. They escorted supply convoys from Alexandria to forward positions at Mersa Matruh and Sidi Barrani. When British forces counterattacked in December, capturing 50,000 Italian prisoners and advancing 200 miles, the destroyers provided naval gunfire support and escorted troop movements. In January 1941, German forces arrived in Libya. The Afrika Korps, under Erwin Rommel, changed the character of the war. German air power meant daytime operations near the coast became suicidal. German tactical skill meant British advances bogged down. The siege of Tobruk began in April 1941. 30,000 Allied troops, mostly Australian 9th Division, were surrounded. They held a port. Supply by sea was possible, just barely. The Tobruk ferry service became the Scrap Iron Flotilla's primary mission through April and May 1941. The destroyers loaded ammunition, food, medical supplies, reinforcements at Alexandria or Mersa Matruh. They departed at dusk to reach Tobruk after dark. They unloaded hurriedly. Loaded wounded and prisoners departed before dawn. Daylight near Tobruk meant air attack. German Junkers 87, Stukas dive, bombed any ship visible from shore. The runs were terrifying. The losses mounted. On June 29, 1941, HMAS Waterhen was making her 13th supply run to Tobruk. 15 Stukas attacked. One bomb hit her engine room. She began sinking. HMS Defender attempted to tow her back to port, but the damage was too severe. Waterhen sank on June 30th. Her crew was rescued. One man was injured by a flying can of fruit. That was the only casualty. But the Scrap Iron Flotilla was reduced to 4 ships. Vampire missed the loss of Waterhen. In March 1941, she had participated in the Battle of Matapan, the decisive defeat of the Italian fleet. She had supported Operation Luster, the movement of British troops from Egypt to Greece. When Germany invaded Greece in April, Vampire participated in Operation Demon, evacuating Allied forces. Over 50,000 troops were withdrawn to Crete and Egypt. Several Royal Navy ships were sunk by air attack. Vampire survived without damage. In May 1941, Germany invaded Crete. The Royal Navy evacuated troops again, losing 3 cruisers and 6 destroyers to air attack. Vampire participated in escort duties, but not the evacuation runs directly. By early June, when Crete fell, she was assigned back to the Tobruk ferry service. She made 2 runs. Then her engines began vibrating excessively at speeds above 16 knots. The turbine bearings were failing. She needed major repairs. On May 29, 1941, Vampire departed the Mediterranean, passing through the Suez Canal. She reached Singapore on June 20th. Repairs took 5 months. Engine overhaul, hull maintenance, updated anti-aircraft armament. A second 2-pounder gun was installed in January 1942. Additional Oerlikon 20mm guns were mounted. The upgrades were modest but improved her defensive capability. Commander William Moran took command in September 1941. Moran was 43 years old, experienced, respected. Repairs completed in November. Final trials concluded November 26th. Vampire was declared operational. She was assigned to the British Eastern Fleet at Colombo. Ceylon, the strategic situation had deteriorated dramatically. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Japan invaded Malaya, Thailand. The Philippines. British forces in Malaya retreated towards Singapore. The naval situation was desperate. On December 8, 1941, Force Z sortied from Singapore, HMS Prince of Wales, HMS Repulse, and 4 destroyers, including Vampire. The mission was to intercept Japanese invasion convoys off Malaya. The force had no air cover. The aircraft carrier HMS Indomitable was to have accompanied them but had run aground in Jamaica during workups. No replacement was available. On December 10th, Japanese bombers from airfields in French Indochina found Force Z-85 Mitsubishi G-3 M-Nell bombers and Mitsubishi G-4 Betty bombers attacked in waves. Vampire and the other destroyers put up anti-aircraft fire. The battleships maneuvered. Prince of Wales took 2 torpedo hits and a bomb hit. Repulse took 4 torpedo hits. Both capital ships sank. Vampire rescued 200 men from Repulse's crew of 800. The destroyers fled south to Singapore under continued air attack. They survived. The battleships were gone. The loss of Force Z ended British naval power in Southeast Asia. Singapore fell on February 15, 1942. The Dutch East Indies fell in March. Burma was invaded. Ceylon and India were threatened. The British Eastern Fleet withdrew to Kilindini in Kenya. Out of range of Japanese air power, a small force remained at Colombo and Trincomalee to defend Ceylon. 4 old battleships, 3 carriers, 8 cruisers, 15 destroyers. Vampire was among them. On March 26, 1942, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's Kido Butai departed the Celebes. 5 fleet carriers, 4 battleships, 3 cruisers, 8 destroyers. Destination: Indian Ocean. Missions: attack British bases at Ceylon, sink British shipping, drive the Eastern Fleet from the Indian Ocean. On April 5, 1942, reconnaissance aircraft spotted Nagumo's force approaching Ceylon. Admiral James Somerville, commanding the Eastern Fleet, ordered all ships at Colombo and Trincomalee to sortie. Get to sea. Disperse. Don't be caught in port when the carriers struck. At 600 hours on April 5th, Japanese carrier aircraft attacked Colombo. They found the harbor mostly empty. Some merchant ships were sunk. Shore installations were bombed, but the major warships had escaped. The same day, 2 British cruisers, HMS Cornwall and HMS Dorsetshire, were caught at sea by dive bombers from the carriers. Both were sunk in minutes. Over 400 men died. On April 8th, HMS Hermes, the light aircraft carrier, was ordered to leave Trincomalee. She had no aircraft aboard. They had been landed for maintenance. She was essentially a merchant ship now, defenseless, incapable of defending herself, but she had to leave. The Japanese would attack Trincomalee next. Vampire was assigned as escort. The 2 ships departed Trincomalee at 2,000 hours on April 8th. They steamed southwest at 14 knots. Hermes's maximum safe speed with her worn-out engines. The coast of Ceylon lay 40 miles to the west. Open ocean to the east. The plan was to reach the southern tip of Ceylon, then proceed north to Colombo where some anti-aircraft defense existed. At 08:30 hours on April 9th, Japanese carrier aircraft attacked Trincomalee. The harbor was empty except for merchant ships and auxiliaries. The shore installations were bombed. Minimal damage was inflicted. The attack was a failure because the valuable targets had already escaped, but Japanese reconnaissance aircraft were searching the area. At 9:35 hours, a Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bomber spotted Hermes and Vampire steaming southwest. The aircraft shadowed them, transmitting position reports. At 10:20 hours, 85 HED-3A Val dive bombers launched from the carriers Akagi, Soryo, and Hiryu. 9 Mitsubishi, a 6M0 fighters escorted them. The strike was massive, far exceeding what was necessary to sink 1 small carrier and 1 destroyer. But Nagumo was taking no chances. Overwhelming force would guarantee success. At 10:35 hours, the first Vals rolled into their dives. Hermes turned hard to port. Vampire turned to follow. Both ships opened fire with every gun they had. The destroyers' 4-inch guns tracked targets at maximum elevation. The 2-pounders hammered. The Oerlikons fired continuously. Some aircraft fell. Most pressed their attacks. Hermes absorbed 40 bomb hits or near misses. The carrier had no armor, no protection. The bombs tore through the flight deck, exploded in the hangar, detonated in the machinery spaces. Fires erupted throughout the ship. Within 10 minutes, Hermes was dead in the water, listing heavily. burning from stem to stern. At 10:37 hours, 3 bombs hit Vampire. The timing is uncertain. Survivors reported the hits occurred almost simultaneously. One bomb struck forward, penetrating into crew spaces below the forecastle. The explosion killed men instantly. It ruptured fuel tanks. Oil sprayed across the deck and ignited. The forward gun mount was knocked out of action. The second bomb hit amidships. This one penetrated to the engine room before detonating. The explosion destroyed one turbine, ruptured steam lines, killed the engineering crew on watch. Power failed immediately. The ship went dead in the water. The third bomb hit aft, exploding near the after magazine. Ready-use ammunition for the depth charges detonated. The stern structure was blown apart. The aftergun mount was destroyed. The deck plating buckled and split. Commander Moran ordered abandoned ship. The forward section was flooding. The amidships section was burning. The aft section was sinking. The ship had perhaps 2 minutes before she went down. Men jumped overboard. Some inflated life rafts. Most simply swam away from the wreck as fast as they could. At 10:39 hours, Vampire broke in half. The forward section rolled to port, the bow rising briefly as water flooded the compartments below. Then it slipped under. The aft section remained afloat longer, the stern high in the air, the propellers still spinning though the engines were destroyed. Then, the sealed compartments failed, and the stern section sank. Commander Moran went down with the forward section. 8 other men were killed by the bomb hits or drowned when the ship sank. 183 survivors were in the water. The Japanese aircraft circled briefly, then departed. They did not strafe the survivors. This was professional courtesy. Perhaps they considered the mission complete and ammunition was needed for other targets. Hermes sank at approximately 10:50 hours. Over 300 men from her crew were killed. The survivors were in the water with Vampire's crew. 3 miles off the coast of Ceylon, the hospital ship HMS Vita arrived at 1400 hours and began recovering survivors. 600 men were pulled from the water. Local fishing vessels rescued others. Some swam to shore. By evening, most of the survivors had been accounted for. Vampire had lost 9 men, a survival rate of 95%. This was extraordinarily high for a ship that sank in 9 minutes. The wreck lies at approximately 7 degrees 35 minutes north, 82 degrees 5 minutes east. Depth exceeds 1,000 meters. The wreck has not been located definitively. A 2005 expedition found Hermes and searched the area but did not locate Vampire. A 2019 survey by HMAS Lewin and HMAS Diamantina used hydrographic equipment and clearance divers. They confirmed the wreck likely lies in a deep trench, inaccessible for recovery. Few artifacts exist. Some photographs and documents are held at the Australian War Memorial. The ship herself is gone. The loss of Vampire ended the scrap iron flotilla's operational history. Of the 5 ships transferred to Australia in 1933, 3 were sunk: Waterhen in June 1941, Vampire in April 1942. Voyager ran aground at Batano Bay, Timor, on September 23, 1942, and was destroyed by Japanese air attack. Stuart and Vendetta survived the war. Stuart served until April 1946. Vendetta served until October 1946. Both were scrapped in 1947. The scrap iron flotilla had served for 33 months of continuous combat operations. From December 1939 to September 1942, they escorted hundreds of convoys. They participated in major fleet actions at Calabria and Matapan. They bombarded enemy positions dozens of times. They evacuated troops from Greece and Crete. They supplied Tobruk. They hunted submarines. They rescued survivors. They did everything destroyers could do, and they paid the price. 3 ships sunk, hundreds of casualties, thousands of hours at sea under combat conditions. The survivors remembered exhaustion, fear, boredom punctuated by terror, the constant vibration of engines pushed beyond their design limits, the stench of unwashed bodies in cramped quarters, the taste of tinned meat and stale bread, the sound of bombs falling and guns firing and men screaming when ships were hit. They also remembered pride. They were the scrap iron flotilla. Joseph Goebbels had given them that name as an insult. They took it as a badge of honor. They were old ships, obsolete ships, ships that should have been scrapped years earlier. But they fought. They accomplished their missions. They proved that determination and skill could compensate for obsolescence. Not always, not perfectly, but enough. The technical reality was harsh. A V-class destroyer from 1917 could not survive in 1942. Vampire had no armor. She had inadequate anti-aircraft armament. Her 4-inch guns were effective against submarines, but marginal against aircraft. Her speed advantage of 34 knots meant nothing when her engines were worn out, and she could barely make 20 knots without vibrating dangerously. Her torpedo tubes never launched at an enemy surface ship during the entire war. She was a relic kept operational through constant maintenance and crew improvisation against the Japanese carrier aircraft that attacked her on April 9, 1942. She had no chance. 85 dive bombers against 1 destroyer. The arithmetic was obvious. Even a modern destroyer with radar-directed 5-inch guns and proximity-fused ammunition would have been overwhelmed. Vampire had open-mount 4-inch guns with optical sights. She had 2-pounder pom-poms effective to 3,000 yards. She had Oerlikon 20mm guns effective to 1,000 yards. The Vals dove from 10,000 feet, released their bombs at 3,000 feet, pulled out at 1,000 feet. Most were never within effective range of Vampire's guns. The only defense was maneuver. Turn hard when the bomb was released. Chase the splash. But with 3 bombs hitting almost simultaneously from different directions, maneuvering was futile. At least one would hit. That was the mathematics of the attack. The Japanese pilots were experienced. They had sunk Prince of Wales and Repulse. They had sunk Cornwall and Dorsetshire. They had attacked targets across the Pacific for 4 months. They knew how to concentrate their attacks to overwhelm defenses. Vampire was outmatched from the moment the Vals appeared. But the mission was necessary. Hermes had to leave Trincomalee. The carrier was vulnerable in port. At sea, she might evade detection. Or she might reach Colombo, where anti-aircraft defenses and potential air cover from Ceylon's handful of fighters would provide some protection. The decision to send Vampire as escort was sound. 1 destroyer was better than none. The risk was accepted because the alternative was worse. That calculation defined the scrap iron flotilla's entire service. Obsolete ships sent to combat zones because newer ships didn't exist. Worn-out engines pushed beyond safe limits because the missions were essential. Crews kept at sea continuously because replacements weren't available. The Mediterranean campaign of 1940 and 1941. The loss of Forces Z. The defense of Ceylon. Every operation risked ships that couldn't afford to be lost. Every operation required those ships anyway because no alternatives existed. The legacy of the scrap iron flotilla is found in their service record. From October 1939 to September 1942. 5 old destroyers operated continuously in the most dangerous waters of the war. They fought at Calabria, Matapan, Greece, Crete, Tobruk, Malaya, Ceylon. They lost 3 ships. They accomplished every mission assigned. They proved that Australia would fight, that Australian sailors were as skilled and brave as any, that old ships properly handled could still make a difference. Vampire's specific contribution was typical. She escorted convoys. She bombarded shore targets. She rescued survivors. She fought when necessary. She withdrew when outmatched. She served until she was sunk. Her crew displayed the professionalism expected of naval personnel. They maintained their ship. They executed their orders. They abandoned ship in good order when the ship was lost. They survived at 95% rate. This reflected training, discipline, and leadership. Commander Moran died with his ship. His crew survived because he gave them time to abandon ship before she went down. The strategic impact is harder to measure. Did the scrap iron flotilla change the outcome of the war? No, not directly. 5 destroyers could not alter the Mediterranean balance or prevent Japanese expansion, but they contributed. Every convoy escorted successfully. Every Italian submarine that stayed submerged rather than attacked because destroyers were present. Every bombardment that disrupted enemy logistics. Every supply run that kept Tobruk supplied. The cumulative effect was significant. More importantly, the scrap iron flotilla demonstrated Australian commitment. When Britain asked for help, Australia sent ships, old ships. Yes, inadequate ships by 1940 standards, but ships that would fight. The symbolism mattered in 1940 when Britain stood alone. Commonwealth support was not automatic. Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand all made independent decisions to support Britain. Sending the scrap iron flotilla to the Mediterranean demonstrated that Australia would fight beside Britain regardless of the cost. That cost was paid. Waterhen, Vampire, Voyage sunk, hundreds of casualties, thousands of hours at sea. Years of operational service under conditions that wore out ships and exhausted crews. And at the end, the ships were gone, scrapped or sunk. The crews dispersed to other ships or demobilized. The flotilla ceased to exist, but the memory remained. The scrap iron flotilla became part of Australian naval tradition. Books were written, memorials were erected. Veterans gathered for reunions. The ships themselves were gone, but the story endured. Old destroyers that fought above their weight. Crews that refused to quit. A flotilla that earned its nickname from an enemy and wore it with pride. HMAS Vampire lies somewhere off Ceylon in water too deep to salvage. Her exact position is uncertain. Her wreck is inaccessible. The ship has corroded into fragments scattered across the seabed, but her service record remains clear. From October 1933 to April 1942, she served Australia and the Commonwealth. She fought in the Mediterranean. She survived the loss of 4C. She died covering the withdrawal of a carrier from an untenable position. She accomplished her mission. Her crew survived. That is the measure of her success. The lesson is straightforward. Wars are fought with the forces available, not the forces desired. In 1939, Australia had 5 old destroyers. They were sent where they were needed. They fought as well as any destroyer could fight. They were lost when the tactical situation made losses inevitable. This is the reality of naval warfare. Ships are expended. Crews are risked. Missions are accomplished or fail based on factors beyond any individual ship's control. Vampire was one ship among thousands lost during the war. Her story matters because it exemplifies the courage and sacrifice of all the ordinary ships and ordinary sailors who fought extraordinary battles under impossible conditions and did their duty regardless of the cost. That is the legacy of HMAS Vampire and the Scrap Iron Flotilla.